All right. So, wow, our listeners have really been sending in a bunch of stuff about these tariffs, this whole thing with the White House and these potential tariffs that keep hinting at. And that Wednesday deadline, April 10th, 2025, it's getting pretty close for comfort.
Yeah, definitely. It's a lot to process.
Yeah.
And I think for a lot of folks, it's easy to get kind of bogged down in all the headlines and the speculation.
Absolutely. And that's what we really want to try to unpack today. We're gonna pull back the curtain a bit, try to cut through the noise, figure out, okay, what are the actual core issues here? Why should this be something that our listeners are really paying attention to and all that,
Right.
without making it feel like, you're suddenly having to become a trade expert or trying to decipher like some ancient scroll written in legalese,
Exactly.
Yeah.
No one wants to feel like they need a PhD in economics to understand what's going on in their own, daily lives and potentially their wallets, right?
Right, exactly. And we're talking, it's Tuesday, April 8th today, so we're really down to the wire here. And that big question mark hanging over everything, the one that seems to be rattling, everyone from Wall Street to Shanghai,
Yeah.
is this a real, like, fundamental shift in how the U.S. is approaching global trade? Is this some kind of high stakes poker game? Are they bluffing?
Well, maybe a little bit of both.
Yeah, is it a blend?
Yeah.
Because that ambiguity, that's really what's creating all this tension and uncertainty, across the board.
Absolutely. And when you have that kind of ambiguity in a global system as interconnected as ours is, both the possibilities and the anxieties they get amplified.
Yeah, for sure. And trying to read the tea leaves, trying to figure out which way this is going to go. It's pretty crucial if we want to understand what the potential fallout might be, down the line.
Right, exactly. It's about connecting those dots and seeing where they might lead us, both in the short term and the long term.
All right, so let's dive right into this mixed messaging thing, right? Coming straight from the White House. Yesterday afternoon, Monday, Oval Office, President makes a statement, and he's basically suggesting that these tariffs could be a permanent thing. Like, this is the new normal. But then in the same breath, he's also talking about them as a way to bring other countries to the negotiating table. It's almost like saying, "Hey, these are the rules. These rules are set in stone, but we're willing to maybe change them if you play ball." It's a real head scratcher.
It's like it's kind of like speaking out of both sides of your mouth, isn't it? I mean, on the one hand, you're suggesting that maybe these tariffs are just the opening bid. They're a starting point to get everyone talking. But on the other hand, the president keeps bringing up the amount of money he thinks these tariffs are going to bring in.
Right.
He keeps throwing out these figures, hundreds of billions, he says. And that really does seem to line up with his longstanding belief in tariffs as a legitimate, policy in and of themselves, not just a bargaining chip.
It's like, that classic thing of saying, I'm going on a diet tomorrow, right? But then tonight you're hitting the all-you-can-eat buffet.
Exactly.
It's really hard to reconcile those two things, right? Like, you're trying to project this image of strength and resolve, but you're also leaving yourself this back door. And in the end, those mixed signals, they just create confusion. And for everyone else trying to figure out what the game plan is.
Well, it makes it almost impossible, right? It's like trying to navigate a maze in the dark.
Exactly. And that confusion, it doesn't just stay abstract, right? It has a very real impact, especially when you look at market stability.
Oh, yeah. The markets hate uncertainty. And this situation is giving them a whole buffet of uncertainty, I mean, take Tuesday morning, for example. Things were looking kind of optimistic. S&P 500 was trending upwards. And you could almost feel this sense of, okay, maybe they are going to negotiate.
Right. A little sigh of relief, maybe.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
But then, boom, the White House confirms that, yeah, they're actually considering these much higher tariffs on China. Like, we're talking potentially a jump all the way to 104%.
Whoa.
And that sent a very different signal, didn't it? Suddenly, it wasn't about a gentle nudge towards the negotiating table. It was a much more aggressive posture. And the market reacted accordingly. The S&P 500 dropped by 1.57% almost immediately.
Ouch.
And for our listener, it's worth noting that the S&P 500 is kind of a bellwether.
Yeah.
It's a key indicator of how investors are feeling about the overall health of the U.S. economy. So a drop like that, it usually means there's some widespread concern.
Well, yeah, and it's not just the financial markets doing this whole, 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of dance. Even within the president's own party, there seems to be some head scratching going on.
Ooh.
Like Senator Ron Johnson, Republican, his response when he was asked about the administration's plan was, well, it was pretty telling. He just kind of threw his hands up and said, does anybody, as if to say, is anyone actually steering this ship?
Yeah, it's like even those who you might expect to be in the inner circle are struggling to grasp what the strategy is here.
Yeah, for sure. And then you contrast that with Senator Tom Tillis, another Republican. His statement was more hopeful, I guess, but it still had this urgency to it, this undercurrent of we need to figure this out and fast.
Right. He was definitely calling for a swift resolution, but you could also hear the recognition that things are pretty fragile right now.
Yeah. And then on the other side of the aisle, you have Senator Elizabeth Warren, and she's not mincing words. She's calling it straight up economic chaos and highlighting a really, really important point. Businesses are going to think twice, 3 times about hiring anyone when they have no clue what the future of global trade looks like.
Right. That uncertainty can really freeze things up.
Yeah.
I mean, who wants to make big decisions like taking on new employees when the ground is shifting beneath your feet?
Absolutely. And that's something that really hits home for a lot of folks, that potential for businesses to just hit the pause button on hiring. That has a nickel effect, right? It can slow down the entire economy. Now, we're also hearing about these tailored deals the president keeps mentioning. It sounds very personalized, like each country is getting its own custom-made agreement. But the details, the actual nuts and bolts, well, they're pretty scarce. And then there's the suggestion that these negotiations could go on for months, even years, and that other countries might have to completely revamp their tax laws. I mean, that sounds like a pretty massive and potentially messy undertaking.
Oh, yeah. No kidding. And, it seems to stem from this core focus, almost an obsession, you could say, that President Trump has with trade deficits. This idea that, if the U.S. is importing more than it's exporting, then that somehow means we're getting a raw deal. And that's a theme that's been constant throughout his career, really.
Right.
Now, for our listeners who may not be as familiar with trade lingo, a trade deficit basically means that a country is buying more stuff from other countries than it's selling to them.
Yeah.
And it's a tricky thing because some people argue that it shows a country isn't competitive enough or that there's some kind of unfair practices going on.
Right, exactly. And we saw this play out very clearly on Truth Social, right? The president's, his favorite platform, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
He posted about South Korea, specifically about their, quote, tremendous and unsustainable surplus with the U.S. And he announced that he actually wrote top team, in all caps, would be coming to the U.S. to make again, in all caps, great deal. Very, very Trumpian language.
Definitely. And it really does paint this picture of very decisive, almost unilateral action to fix what he sees as these trade imbalances.
Right. Like he's saying, I'm the deal maker and I'm going to set things straight. Now, what's interesting is that this whole focus on trade deficits, it doesn't seem to apply equally to everyone. For example, there was this exchange with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, and the idea came up of eliminating Israel's trade deficit with the U.S. And the response was, well, it was much less forceful, especially considering the huge amount of military aid that the U.S. provides to Israel. It kind of suggests that this isn't purely about the bottom line,
Yeah.
There are other factors at play here, geopolitics, existing alliances.
Absolutely. There's a whole web of relationships and strategic interests that feed into these decisions. It's never as simple as just, who's buying what from whom.
Right, exactly. It adds a whole other layer of complexity, and it makes it even harder to figure out, what the president's end game really is. So let's go back to that fundamental question, right? Are these tariffs, are they really just a negotiating tactic, a way to squeeze concessions out of other countries, or is this a true policy shift? Are we moving towards a more protectionist stance where the U.S. is kind of pulling back from global trade and focusing more inward? We did hear the president on Air Force One refer to tariffs as a great power to negotiate. That does seem to point to a more strategic intent, right?
Yeah, it implies that the goal is to gain leverage, to pressure other countries into making changes to existing trade agreements or to sign new ones that are more favorable to the U.S. But then later, when he gets back to D.C., he starts talking about tariffs as a necessity, and he dismisses the stock market's negative reaction as just, as he puts it, medicine that sometimes needs to be taken.
Right. Like a bitter pill that we have to swallow for the greater good. And that does seem to suggest a deeper belief in tariffs as a valid policy, regardless of what the markets think, or even what some members of his own party think.
Exactly. And it's that contrast, that shifting between those two framings that really highlights the uncertainty, the lack of a clear and consistent message. And it's not just the president himself. Even his advisors seem to be sending mixed signals.
Yeah, it's almost like they're all reading from different scripts. Like you have Peter Navarro writing in the Financial Times, and he's going all in. He's calling this a national emergency. He's talking about a rigged system, really strong language.
Yeah, painting a picture of a dire situation that demands, drastic action. But then you have people like Kevin Hassett and Scott Bessent, and they're suggesting that actually a lot of countries are pretty keen to negotiate. Bessent even mentioned that April, May, June could be, busy months for trade talks. It sounds a lot less like an emergency and a lot more like, just another round of diplomatic meetings.
Right, right. Like business as usual almost. And then you have Stephen Miran, the chair of the President's Council of Economic Advisors, and he actually described these conflicting viewpoints as healthy debate. And I mean, diversity of opinion, that's definitely valuable when you're trying to craft policy. But from the outside looking in, it does make it really hard to get a clear sense of, okay, what's the actual direction here?
Right. It creates this fog of uncertainty that makes it difficult to anticipate what's coming next.
Right.
And, economist Michael Strain from the American Enterprise Institute, he brings up a really important point, which is that these two goals, the goal of reshaping global trade and the goal of using tariffs as a negotiating tactic, well, they might actually be at odds with each other. Like maybe by being so aggressive with these tariffs, you actually alienate potential partners and make it harder to reach any kind of lasting agreement.
Right, right. It's almost like you're trying to strong arm people into doing what you want, but in the process, you might be burning bridges that you need to build those agreements.
Exactly. It's a question of whether the short-term gains of flexing your muscles are worth the potential long-term damage to relationships and to trust.
Yeah, and Senator John Kennedy from Louisiana, he seemed to echo that sentiment. He criticized some of the president's aides, saying that they, quote, just like to talk. And I think you can sense the frustration there, not just from him, but from businesses in his state and across the country who are basically saying, look, we need some clarity, some consistency, so we can make informed decisions.
Right. Businesses need predictability. They need to be able to plan. And this level of uncertainty makes that incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
And it's not just a domestic issue either. This lack of clear direction, it has big implications on the international stage, especially with major trading partners like China. I mean, China hasn't just been sitting back and taking these tariffs, right? They've already implemented retaliatory tariffs of their own, which are currently at 34%. And that's not a small number.
Yeah, and the potential for those to escalate even further to 104%, like we mentioned earlier, that really does shift the dynamic, doesn't it? It moves beyond a typical negotiation, a back and forth, and it starts to feel more like a trade war, a cage match where everyone's just trying to inflict as much pain as possible.
Right. And the longer that goes on, the harder it is to step back from the brink.
Yeah. Now, there was a glimmer of something positive in the interaction with Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba. And that did actually give a little boost to the Nikkei, which is Japan's stock market. But the details of that interaction are still pretty vague. And when you factor in the existing tariffs that are already in place between the U.S. and Japan, some of them are pretty hefty, 24% on certain products, 25% on auto imports. And those are way higher than what Japan typically charges on imports.
So it makes you wonder, even if there's this friendly talk, this positive rhetoric, how much room is there really for major concessions? Right. And the gap between those existing tariff levels, that asymmetry, it's a key factor. It's not like both sides are coming to the table with, equal footing.
Right. And even House Speaker Mike Johnson, while he expressed confidence that, the American people understand the president's objectives and that they're giving him the, quote, space to do what he needs to do, well, you can kind of hear this underlying sense that space is shrinking.
Yeah, that clock is ticking.
Yeah, and that Wednesday deadline is looming large. There's this tension between giving the president the leeway to pursue his agenda and the increasing pressure from everyone else, businesses, markets, international partners, who are all basically saying, we need to know what's going on here.
Exactly. The longer the uncertainty drags on, the more potential there is for unintended consequences.
Okay, so let's bring this back to you, our listener, right? The average person out there who's trying to make sense of all this. What could this wave of tariffs, if it actually happens, what could it mean for you, for your everyday life, and for your wallet?
Well, it sounds like we could be looking at higher prices on on a lot of the stuff that we buy,
Yeah.
things that are imported, everything from electronics like your TV to clothes like your sneakers.
Yeah.
If businesses have to pay more to bring those goods into the country, well, they're going to pass those costs along to us, the consumers.
Right. Those import costs have a way of trickling down through the entire system, and they usually end up showing up as higher prices at the checkout. And then there's the whole uncertainty factor. If businesses don't know what the rules are going to be, if they're worried about these tariffs constantly changing, well, they might be less likely to invest in new equipment, to expand their operations, to hire new employees, and that can have a real impact on job growth, on wages, on the overall health of the economy. Right. Now, it is important to acknowledge the other side of this argument, right? The argument that the president and his supporters are making. They're saying that this tough stance, it might actually force other countries to negotiate better deals for the U.S., deals that could bring back manufacturing jobs, that could boost the economy in the long run. So there's this potential upside, but it comes with a lot of risk, a lot of unknowns. And that's really what makes this whole situation so tricky.
Exactly. A gamble with potentially high rewards, but also with the possibility of some pretty serious consequences.
So, as we get closer to that Wednesday deadline, that big question mark hanging over everything is, will we see some kind of last minute deal? Will there be a flurry of diplomacy, some kind of agreement hammered out, or maybe a delay in implementing these tariffs? Or will the president just go ahead with it and we'll be entering this new era of trade policy, one that's potentially much more protectionist?
And what's really striking is that, even with this deadline just a couple of days away, we're still not getting a clear, consistent message from the White House. And that lack of information, that's what's driving all this uncertainty, making it so hard for businesses, for individuals to plan for the future.
Yeah, it's like the whole global economy is just holding its breath, waiting to see what happens. So, as you go about your day, going to work, going to the store, think about all the little ways that this cloud of uncertainty around trade policy, think about how it might already be affecting things, the prices you see, the news you hear, the decisions that businesses are making. What happens when the rules of the game keep changing? How do we navigate that? It's a big question and one that we'll all be grappling with as this situation unfolds.